everybody. Welcome to a new session of Conversations with Iris, the podcast on migration, displacement, and mobility produced by the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. My name is Palladia Cis. I'm a PhD student at Iris. And today we will talk about a topic that is really essential to doing any kind of research on mobility and displacement, any kind of research really, but that is not often given enough attention. The politics and ethics of working with local researchers and research assistants in forced migration and refugee studies. And I'm really happy that today I will be joined by Mina Sadr, who is an alumni of American University in Kabul, Afghanistan, and she's at the moment based in Albania. Welcome, Mina. She was previously working with Hannah Poole, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. And Hannah recently completed her PhD thesis on Afghan trajectories from Iran to Europe. Welcome, both of you. So, Hannah, maybe you can tell me, or tell us actually, tell the audience a little bit about your research and how did you meet Mina? How and what did you work on together?
Yeah, thank you for inviting us to the podcast. My research was on Afghan migration trajectories from Afghanistan, but actually starting in Iran, to Western Europe. And in that, I was able to accompany people on their trajectories by continuing the route with them, through Iran and then Turkey, Greece, along the so-called Balkan route up to Germany. And I was always looking at the role of economic interactions and social relationships that actually make it possible to cross borders undocumented in order to seek asylum in Western Europe. And I conducted the field research between 2018 and 2020 until COVID hit. And I did the research in Farsi. At one point, I realized, as I believe most qualitative researchers do at one point, that the interviews were just accumulating. And I started to transcribe them in Farsi. And I noticed that although I can handwrite with Farsi, my typing was really slow on the computer. At the same time, I realized that I was not able to do these hours and hours of interviews. I realized that I needed help from someone who is able to transcribe the interviews. But also I was thinking that I would like to work with someone who, him or herself, had not done the trajectory. So not, for example, an Afghan person who now was living in Germany. And because I was really afraid that people would re-experience this through interviews. And then, to be very honest, it was one of these magic moments that sometimes happen in research when you're so frustrated and you really question the entire concept, what you do. And then suddenly you get this one WhatsApp message from this one friend who is by chance telling you that in that case, she had worked together with an amazing student who herself was still living in Kabul, who was living in Afghanistan, and who had done tremendous work helping her with her research. And that is how I then met Mina. And actually our relationship then meant so much more to me, because at first I was just thinking I met someone who could help me transcribe these interviews. What I later then realized was that I had met someone who will in the end be the only person in the world who had also heard the exact same interviews that I had conducted, something that I couldn't share with anyone else. And maybe as a last note, I did a multi-sided ethnography, like Mark Cruz and Hannah have described. So a lot of my research was also ethnographic. So I'm really here talking about the actual interviews that were recorded, where people then at first gave their consent, and also something that people wanted to be heard by a larger audience that extended me as a single researcher. So for me, these were not just interviews, but also in a way testimonies. And they meant a lot to me, but also to the participants. So finding someone who was also trustworthy and who could really work with them, and bringing out people's characters, including the laughters, and really going also in the local dialects, like to really bring out how people spoke about their own experience. That was what I was hoping to find, and then Mina came along, who included all this.
Yeah, and Mina, what was this like for you? So you had done some research before, but then you were also contacted by Hannah. How was it like for you? Can you tell us about your side of the story?
Sure. I work as a research assistant with our mutual friend. I have received her email of her who won the help transcribing the interviews. Me, as a student, got the knowledge of how to conduct research throughout my studies. At the same time, the practical work that I have done with another German researcher.
So do you transcribe and translate it as well?
Because I speak and read and write Farsi, it was really just a Farsi transcription, and it was only in the very last weeks before submitting the dissertation that I then finally myself translated them into English. But all the Farsi quotes, so those that Nina transcribed, are still in my footnotes, because for me it was very important that participants, if they would ever read this dissertation, they are able to not just see my own transcription, or Nina's transcription, but also can really go back to what they originally said in Farsi, because there's so much power that lies in translating.
Okay. So Mina, I mean, as everybody knows who's in social sciences, like transcribing is very time consuming and quite exhausting. And the stories that people were sharing, what was it like for you to actually listen to them yourself?
Yeah, for me, it was having like firsthand information of what other immigrants are going through. Is some of them were really shocking. I knew that it's not on their hands that they're deciding to go and seek refuge to another country. And I also knew that the experiences that they are going through are harsh, but each individual had their own story of how they escaped Afghanistan for seeking a better future. And at the same time, the struggles that they were facing during those phases of getting out of Afghanistan, out of fear of getting prosecuted or any other reason, and going to other countries through illegal routes and experiencing harsh moments. Those all were really new for me. And it was not only about transcribing each and every word. At the same time, it was about even writing about their emotions, how they are feeling, whether they are sad, disappointed, exhausted, or happy about their situation. And for me, it was really interesting also because I was getting all this new firsthand information of my own people, how they are trying to have better life, the struggles that, for example, girls and women they were facing through these immigration routes. At the same time, every batch of the interviews that I was transcribing, I was kind of discussing the sociopolitical issues involved with those stories with Hannah, and explaining that how things are going on here there in Afghanistan while I was living there.
So Hannah, what was this like for you? Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think I'd like to take up two notions that Nina said. One is the emotions, and also the emotional labor that in a way we both conducted. There were moments when people started talking when I was already in my head, not just thinking of the person sitting in front of me, but also in a way thinking of how Nina will transcribe this. And this became especially the case when what Nina just said, when it was interviews with women who experienced sexual violence along the way. And there were 3 interviews where women by themselves, without being asked, were describing either sex work taking place and the rates for which women sold their bodies, or when women described being raped by others along the trajectory. And I was very troubled in that moment conducting the interview, but I could do something. I could continue talking to the person, but I also knew when Nina will listen to this, to transcribe this, she will be on her own. She will be 1,000 kilometers away. She cannot do anything for the participant or for the informant to kind of also in that moment just to be there. She just has to bear witness, and she just has to write down these words. and we had a long WhatsApp phone conversation before I sent her this interview, and I told her what the content was. And I asked her if she wants to transcribe this, and that I absolutely understand if she doesn't want to do that. Or I remember this so well, how Mina said, okay, I thank you so much for thinking about me, but send them to me, I'll listen to them. And I'm living in Kabul right now. There are so many horrific things going on, and this is what my people are continuously experiencing. For me, sharing this with someone was a huge relief, and at the same time, for me, often it meant giving this burden to someone else. And I often wondered, is that justified? Is it not?
Mina, do you want to comment on this? Yeah, I was really touched by the kindness of Hannah while we had the phone call, and she discussed that whether I am mentally capable of transcribing all those scenarios that people, especially the women, are going to describe about the sexual abuses or harassment. It's true that in the reality, while I was living in Afghanistan, there were several harsh scenarios going on. People were killed daily through the suicide attacks, and I was always facing violence against women, girls, and women have been suppressed through that patriarchal society that we had. But at the same time, it had some new aspects to it, like how they went to other country without anyone else helping them, only by the help of their own female companions, and how they supported through the route each other. I really appreciated their courage. And
maybe just like one final question about your relationship. So were there actually also some points in your collaboration where you were questioning each other, or whether where there were some conflicts as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. We were sharing ideas most of the time, but I haven't noticed any conflicting point or clash point between us. In some instances, I remember that Hannah was asking or seeking my help, that how some sentences in particular context, how she can interpret it. I remember those scenarios that I helped her with the translation and giving and explaining things from a much more broader perspective, rather than sticking to a literal meaning of some words or some expressions in a sentence.
Hannah, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think we ever had any issues between us on a emotional bond or so. I think the challenges that we faced, they were challenges from the outside. And this was, for example, and I think that's something to very openly address, because this is just getting more and more severe. For example, how can I get Nina the money that she deserves? Because it was really difficult at the time, and now it's, I think, impossible to transfer the money from a German institution to her account in Afghanistan. And this was something where I was really fighting or debating very strongly with institutions in Germany, because I wanted to make sure that she receives her money as soon as possible. But that was very hard. And now at the moment, I think it's almost impossible to get money to people in Afghanistan who really deserve it, especially if they are still brave enough to conduct research.
I mean, as I understand, Mina, you're now based in Albania, and you had to actually leave Afghanistan, right? So now, can you share a little bit about how this experience of having first listened to all those stories of fleeing Iran and Afghanistan and you being forced to leave? So can you share, how is this like for you now?
Yep. So for me, transcribing other people's scenarios of seeking refuge to another countries was new, but I have never imagined myself in that situation of becoming a refugee. But unfortunately, by taking over of the power in Afghanistan by Taliban, I had no other choice but to seek refuge. And I had all those scenarios in my mind that how refugees were treated in other countries. But now when I came to Albania, my experience here, it's really different from what I have heard from the stories and the interviews. My life and how I ended up in Albania the first. But overall,
sorry, Mina, just to quickly explain this. So you have actually been able to leave Afghanistan legally, yeah? You have been evacuated, so you didn't have to go through the informal means, yeah?
Yes, although I seek legal means to get to another country, to the final destination that I want. So the treatment that I get from the Albania government and Albanian people is really different from what I have heard. Here we live in a good and much more better situation than the people that were explaining their ideas regarding the camp. The refugees that have been evacuated to Albania, they are living in a resort. So my experience totally differs from what other people have experienced in that interviews. It's totally different. But at the same time, I see the trauma that they were facing. Although I do not have to cross illegally the borders, but I am facing the same traumatic situation of leaving behind my family in Afghanistan, of the threat that I was facing, or all the things that I left behind in Afghanistan, the things that I have been grown up on over that 20 years with the values, and I learned several things through the democratic process, the democratic government that we had. But all of a sudden, losing that and becoming refugee in another country, all this process is, of course, traumatic. It's not easy to cope with here in Albania, although we are living in a safe place. Of course, physically, we are safe, but mentally, all the time, the thoughts of me is there with my people at Afghanistan living in a harsh situation, or the girls coping with really hard time being or facing a general apartheid policy by Taliban.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something really interesting. So you say kind of there's different layers to this. One is that the means of leaving the country, of course, makes a difference. So if you are able to go legally somewhere, leave the country legally, it makes the situation that you, at least in the first country of refuge, just makes it a bit safer. You might not necessarily have to face all the dangers of that you mentioned earlier that people experience, for example, in the camp of Moria. But at the same time, you have the same being uprooted in some ways, in the same trauma of being disconnected from your family back home, and also worrying about what's going on there, right?
Yes.
Maybe from the researcher's point, I submitted my dissertation in March last year, and then in August, in end of July, it was very clear where developments would head to. And one of the first thoughts that I had was, in my acknowledgement of the dissertation, I wrote "thank you" to Mina Sadr. And I immediately called our university and our institute in order to ask them to kind of blur that part, because I was afraid that this dissertation would become public somewhere. And it felt so wrong to cut out Mina in my acknowledgements. But at that time, I was just so worried that something could happen to her. And then by the 14th of August, when the Taliban sought power, suddenly I was just thinking of Mina and hearing from her, getting the text when she had to stay at home, but also continuously thinking, what if I endangered her? I then was invited as a researcher to go to several panels, and our roles, in a way, for me at least, they shifted, because then it was Mina sending me messages on Signal, giving me kind of the talking points, what I should address in the panels at that time, because it was not possible for her to speak out loud. These are really the first 2 weeks after the Taliban sought power, to sit on the stage and speak of a brave woman who just told me. Of course, without naming this amazing woman of Mina Satter, who now can speak in public about her experience. And I think that was really a shift from the person who had been there in the background for me emotionally to guide me through this research process and transcribe interviews for me, to now be there and, in a way, tell me from her experience so that I could share that with others in Europe.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. So I guess, for me, the key takeaways from this conversation are, first of all, the emotional labor of doing research that we sometimes underestimate, I think, both for the researcher, but especially for the people who are for research assistants, especially if they are very deeply in the situation that we are researching, and we are not necessarily. So I guess this insider outsider perspective a little bit. The second thing is the continuity of displacement, and how the political context and the social context, the socio-political context of displacement just doesn't happen to just be finished just because we don't research, we kind of move on to a different project, but it continues to affect people, both who are our participants as well, who are our supporters and collaborators locally. And the third thing is maybe about the continuity, about relationships, how important that is, and also to, I guess, talking to each other and maintaining a relationship on an equal level. And actually the fourth thing, probably also how what you mentioned briefly, Hannah, earlier, about how the bureaucracy and the systematic struggles and challenges that affect these kind of relationships, and that make it difficult actually sometimes to maintain this personal connection over time. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.